All right. So, hello, everyone. Good to be back with you again. And I'm going to jump right in. I've got a lot to talk about today, but I do want to start just with an initial indication. Um, you have been, I don't know if it's patient or indulgent with me. I have been talking with you about inequality for a very long time. We've interrupted it at various points when other current events have come to the fore. But one of the things we also talk about is contemporary politics. And last time I checked, although it's a bizarre election season, we are in the middle of a presidential election. You might say a quite fateful presidential election. And so I will go back to talking with you about some more current events soon. I believe this will be the second to last lecture in this series. And then by the end of the month, the beginning of the coming month, we can really start focusing on what's happening in American politics. I imagine some of you may be a little impatient for that. But I do want to finish off what I've been talking with you about for at least a couple months now, and that is rising inequality in the United States and how to understand it, where it comes from, what its implications and social impacts are, and assuming that you are convinced, as I am, that it is harmful, that it is unjust, that it is fraying the fabric of our social life, what we do about it. And that's the topic that's mainly left. And so that is where I'm going to pick up today. I am going to spend a moment on a piece of contemporary news, and just to explain briefly the title, from objecting to inequality to doing something about it, I'm going to be transitioning from the work in moral and political philosophy about inequality into public policy work today. And so that's the two topics for today's lecture, the bridge I'm trying to build. But before I do that, I want to talk about John Lewis, who died last night. As I imagine most of you are already aware, it's dominating the news this morning. And as you, I'm sure, are aware, John Lewis was an icon of the civil rights movement. This is him in 1960 at a sit-in in Georgia. And this is him just 5 years ago receiving the Medal of Freedom, President Obama. And I want to point out to you that in a sense, as I would put it, his life traversed the arc of the freedom struggles of the 20th century. This is him in the aftermath of one of several savage beatings he suffered in his life. And this is in particular the Freedom Rides. And this is him in his congressional office, where he served for, I believe, 26 years as a representative from Georgia. And so he went from being a man who was excluded from even eating in the same space in restaurants in Georgia to being a man who received the highest award, or the highest honor our society mets out, as well as being a long-standing congressperson who in many ways was, as he is frequently described, the conscience of the Congress, especially on civil rights issues. And I want to quote two brief lines from John Lewis, one of them from his memoir, explaining the idea of redemptive suffering, which was an idea that he borrowed from Mahatma Gandhi. And he put it in his memoir as following. There is something in the very essence of anguish that is liberating, cleansing, redemptive. Suffering touches and changes those around us as well. it opens us and those around us to a force beyond ourselves, a force that is right and moral, the force of righteous truth that is at the basis of human conscience. I want to just think about the relevance of this idea for a moment. I'm not suggesting that many of us can or should suffer the way John Lewis suffered, right? His skull was fractured on a voting rights march in Selma when a police officer hit him with a baton. He was bloodied many times. His appearance, and part of the reason to juxtapose these images from him as a young man and him as an older man, he is physically disfigured from the punishment he took as he courageously braved the forces of violence trying to maintain Jim Crow in the South in the early 1960s to the middle 1960s. I'm not suggesting that most people in this country can or should do that, although if we look at what's happening in Portland, Oregon right now with the use of federal troops to put down mainly peaceful protests there, we may wonder whether this kind of nonviolent civil action is still, in fact, justified by our immediate circumstances. But I want to focus on a different kind of cleansing sacrifice, the kind of cleansing sacrifice in a sense that Abraham Lincoln described in his second inaugural address, in which he talked about America atoning in blood for the sin of slavery. And again, I don't think we need a civil war, but I do think we are in a moment of national reckoning about racial inequality. And I would point out to you that although the focus is primarily on African Americans and Black Lives Matter, we are rapidly becoming a more diverse society, and that has in large measure to do with the rapid increase of Latinos and also Asians as a proportion of our population. And that, in a sense, I'm sorry to say, it seems to me that the election campaign of Donald Trump in 2016 involved shifting American racial animus from African Americans to people of Latin American descent. And that this is a moment then for us as we approach a national election to think about the relevance of John Lewis and to think about the debt of racial justice that he encourages us to pay, and that the kind of suffering that perhaps we owe is not bodily. It's not putting ourselves in harm's way, but that the cleansing that comes with making a sacrifice that most Americans might need to experience is more a surrendering of privilege and advantage at this historical moment. And I want to be concrete. I think we owe African Americans reparations. I think that if we want to emerge from the ordeal of diversification that we're undergoing as a multiracial democracy, we need to face and exercise our racial past, and that John Lewis encourages us to do this. And so then one other quote from John Lewis, and this is from his speech in March in Washington in 1963. He spoke just a little bit before Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And among other things, he called for a revolution and encouraged all of those who were in attendance and those who were listening to get into this great revolution that is sweeping this nation. Get in and stay in the streets of every city, every village and hamlet of this nation until true freedom comes, until a revolution is complete. We must get in this revolution and complete the revolution. And in a sense, I suppose we should be happy, right? John Lewis announced that he was suffering from advanced cancer in late December of last year, we should be happy that he lived long enough to see what's happening in our streets right now. And there is certainly some risk, some risk that there will be a politics of reaction and retrenchment, that Donald Trump and others will succeed in motivating fear because of these protests. But I, for one, believe the protesters have to stay the course. The debt that is owed is too great, that the issues are too urgent, the momentum is too precious to surrender, even if the prospect is potentially strengthening the hand of Donald Trump. But I would point out to you, finally, that that does not appear to be coming, or at least to be happening right now. That, as a matter of fact, Donald Trump is getting very low approval ratings for the way in which he's handling issues of racial inequality, police violence, and justice. And so perhaps finally, American public opinion is supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement and the protest in our streets. All right. Should I pause for a second? It occurs to me that many of you may have more specific recollections of John Lewis than I do. I was reading a little while back about when Lewis was on the march to Selma, the voting rights march, and was beaten brutally on national TV. And I hadn't realized this. I think it was on ABC. I'm not positive about that. They were airing Justice at Nuremberg, and they interrupted Justice at Nuremberg. I'm laughing at it. In a sense, it's momentous to show what was happening on that bridge. And I do think that, in a sense, the juxtaposition between what the Nazi regime did and what the Southern Jim Crow regime was doing provided the kind of visual evidence and text that we're now getting with the awful recorded murder of George Floyd and others who've been caught on camera, other police assaults caught on camera recently. So let me stop for a moment and just ask if anybody has comments they want to share, recollections, etc. I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody, so just beware that now you are on a live mic. All right, anybody with a comment or a thought?
David, Susan
Yes.
Levy here. Will he be replaced by a Republican appointee by the governor of Georgia?
That's a very good question. I have no idea. And I suppose the good news is that there's an election coming up in November, right? So even if Kemp does appoint a Republican, and you know, I guess it depends in part on what the norms and laws are in Georgia, right? Is it the case that you are supposed to, or even required to, appoint someone from the same party? I don't know, but be that as it may, there will be another election. John Lewis had announced in December that he had terminal cancer. I don't know the details happening in that election, but my guess is that there's already something. Anyone else with a question or a comment at this moment? Okay, then I'm going to go ahead and mute you. And remember, all you have to do is hit your space bar, and feel free to interject at any point that you want. Going back then into the material from our ongoing lecture series, let me get that open again. And just very quickly, I want to remind you that last week, as we welcomed the new people from Grand Lake, we did a little bit of a review of the material and the course as a whole. As a result of my own thoroughness and slowness, we're not done with T.M. Scanlon's Why Does Inequality Matter? We will finish that today. And that's the end of our excursus on philosophy, our effort to think about whether or not our intuitions about inequality being objectionable are in fact well grounded. And I've tried to make the case that they are, and Scanlon is going to help us to see exactly what is objectionable about inequality. And then I'm going to conclude this lecture series by looking at public policy issues. And in particular, I'm going to try to differentiate two different kinds of initiatives. What I'm going to call stage one reforms, not very creative, are those that are readily available to us, that perhaps the coronavirus pandemic even makes more likely that they can be rapidly enacted. And so part of my suggestion here is, at the same time that we're trying to bolster and strengthen an economy that has been seriously weakened by the economic effects of a pandemic, we look to the need to also think about long-term repair to inequality. And some of the measures that I'm going to discuss to you, and I think this is important, do not require federal government action. And I'm going to suggest that one of the problems with egalitarian public policy initiatives is that our federal government, especially the legislature and the interaction between the legislature, the executive, and the courts, are so polarized, and as a result so paralyzed, that it's very difficult to get action on the national level, and that we have perhaps channeled too much of our energy into national action, and that we need to recognize that as urgent as that is, and as limited as more local initiatives are, we need to focus where we can get things done. And that may even be at the place you work, or the school you attend. It doesn't even have to be a governmental level of action. I'll talk more about that. But the point of stage one reforms is either because of the pandemic or because they can be accomplished locally. These are things that could be done quickly without perhaps having to fundamentally alter the political climate before we get action. Stage two reforms are more systematic efforts to promote equality, and they do require a change in the political climate of Washington, D.C. We do have a federal system. The federal government, as we have seen with the virus, has much greater capacity, much deeper pockets, many more levers to pull to change things at the national level than do the states or the localities or the everyday organizations of civil society. And so the stage two reforms, these are ideas, and it's important to have as good and clear ideas as possible. For instance, about resuming or returning progressivity, redistribution to the federal income tax system, making the federal income tax and federal taxation a mechanism for equalizing the distribution of wealth in our society, as opposed to a mechanism for amplifying inequality, which in many respects it has become over the last 50 odd years. And so those are the two stages of reform I want to discuss with you. I will concentrate on the first today, but before doing that, I've got to finish up with my old teacher, T.M. Scanlon. You will remember he's the author of one of the most influential works in moral philosophy published in the last 50 years, What We Owe to Each Other, that we're concentrating on his book, Why Does Inequality Matter? That his central principle as a contractualist, as someone who believes that morality, moral principles are created by us, not found out there in the universe, and that the method of constructing moral principles is a bit like drawing a contract. It's reaching a free, unforced, informed general agreement. And that in particular, what that then requires is that we justify ourselves to each other. And that when we justify ourselves to each other, the standard has to be that no one who we seek to justify ourselves to can reasonably reject the principles that we are proposing, that each person essentially has a veto. And assuming that all people have goodwill, that all people are actually looking for agreement, then it's appropriate as a display of respect for the equal moral agency of all individuals to give each person that right, the right to say, I'm not satisfied with this, if they can show the reasons that let them reasonably reject the principles. And Scanlon recognizes that in a sense, this may seem a little vacuous, right? You're telling me that we need principles that no one can reasonably reject. Are there any such principles? If so, what are they? And so in his subsequent work, in The Difficulty of Tolerance and Why Does Inequality Matter, Scanlon has set out to demonstrate that there are, in fact, reasons to accept principles of tolerance, reasons to reject too extensive an inequality. And I will be clear, Scanlon has a marvelous mind. He's one of the most impressive thinkers I have encountered in my life. He is using that mind to try to put himself, if you will, in fictive dialogue with everyone else. One of the things that is sometimes said about contractualism is, you'll have to excuse the jargon, that it is omnilogical, that it tries to think through things for everyone from the point of view of someone, right? And that ideally, we wouldn't just have to have Tim Scanlon thinking through these issues. We could have a genuine dialogue as opposed to, right, an omnilogue. And in a sense, I think Scanlon is open to that idea, but he nevertheless wants to do his best to display for us the reasons that he believes would be convincing, not just to him, but to all persons. Now, I'm going to be fast about this. This is still mainly review. He presents, and I know, and I'm sorry, there are way too many words and lines on this little screen. I hope nobody is trying to view this on a phone. It's bad enough on a computer. But this is the anatomy of reasons, right, that I was describing to you for rejecting inequality. And some of them have to do with when inequality gets to be large enough. And I should point out that Scanlon is not saying that it's never justifiable to depart from equality. Far from it. He's suggesting that oftentimes equality is problematic and inequality is justified. We wouldn't want a symphony orchestra in which we chose the first violin by lot from anybody who'd had a year's worth of violin instructions, right? We want the best violinist to be featured in the solo, et cetera, right? And so the issue is when inequality becomes of a kind that generates specific harms or specific objections. And so this is meant to be, as I say, an anatomy of the reasons. And obviously these reasons, as they are articulated in specific contexts, have different forms of supporting argument, are elaborated in different ways. And so one objection would be that when things become too unequal, you end up with status differences. You end up with people feeling that some people deserve more respect and others less respect just because of the way their status is marked. And so to give an example, if the status differences between the rich and the poor, that may have one feel to it, and the harm of status difference that results, which sometimes is referred to as the hidden injury of class, right? People don't respect you. They talk down to you. They don't think that you have good ideas because of your accent or the way you dress or your address, the way you comport yourself. All they want to do is tell you what to do and not listen to you. That might be different from the harm of a racial status system or a gender status system. But the underlying logic of a status system is still there. And one of the things that Scanlon is suggesting is that it's inherently objectionable, and it is objectionable when inequality in wealth and income are of such a level that they lead to status difference. The harm of lack of control over one's own life, I think this is pretty straightforward, right? Whereas in the first kind of harm, it's that too much inequality in resources, wealth, income leads to status difference. In the second objection, it's that too much inequality leads to differences in power, right? And so if you no longer can make the most important decisions for yourself because you are beholden to somebody else who has so much capacity to impact your life that you have to bow to their will, you are not an equal. You can object to that reasonably and object to the inequality in power or wealth or resources that gives rise to it. A lack of equality of opportunity or an unfair monopolization of positions and advantages. There's a third category of reasons. I'm going to try to be faster here. A fourth category is political fairness or unfairness, and the idea that each of us should have an equal opportunity to influence the outcomes of political decision-making, fundamental to democracy, and that if we have too great a difference in wealth and resources, that almost inevitably translates into unequal political impact. A second category of objections to extensive inequality comes not from the harm that inequality does, but the way in which inequality arises, the process giving rise to it. And so you might think of these objections as having to do with the intrinsic unfairness of the way inequality is generated. So equality of concern when institutions or groups distribute goods is, on Scanlon's account, a basic requirement. If I work at a college and there's a principle that the people who are more senior get better offices, but I routinely get passed over for the better office, and somebody else who's much younger than I am, but who happens to be in the good books of the dean, gets the office that I've been waiting patiently for, I have an objection. And it's not just a petty objection, I wanted that office. It's that this institution is supposed to treat all its members the same, all its members equally, all its members fairly. It's supposed to show equal concern for all of us, or you've got to give me a reason. Actually, that's a handicap accessible office, and the person you're objecting to actually has an invisible disability that makes it such that they need to be in that office. That's a good reason. Thank you very much. But if the only reason is I like that person better, then the institution is no longer operating with equal concern for all its members, and the institution is going to lose its legitimacy, and I have a good ground for objection. Similarly, when income inequality is generated by unfairness in economic institutions, if it's the case that people who are from this school always get jobs at that law firm, and nobody else ever gets a job at that law firm. The old boys network is so strong that it essentially just screens everybody else out, right? It's not necessarily that the people at the law firm make too much money. It's just that the access to that good is unfairly constricted. All right, so having reviewed all of that, let me now get into some of the newer material. I need to keep track of the time too. I'm going to start with Scanlon's critique of status inequality. Status inequality means, right, a kind of inequality that is marked by the way in which you possess certain goods and what that says about you. What kind of car do you drive? What kind of clothes do you wear? What is the neighborhood you live in? What kind of vacation you can take? What kind of school you send your children to, etc. By the way, it can also be marked by race. It can also be marked by gender. It can also be marked by religion. I think it's worthwhile noting it doesn't appear so much anymore, but it is the case that for much of human history, religious differences have translated into status differences as well. So when we're talking about status inequality, what are the objections to it? And to be clear, I think in a sense, Scanlon is suggesting that in a just society, the only kind of status difference would be, I shouldn't say status difference, the only relevant status would be the status of equal citizen. And so that might help to see the implications of his very strong egalitarian position. So the wrongs of discrimination are the first category in this anatomy of reasons to object to status inequality. And the first wrong of discrimination is quite simply that the characteristics on which discrimination is based do not justify the attitudes and differences in treatment that form discrimination, right? And so what contractualism, what Scanlon's approach says, is if you're going to influence somebody significantly, if the way in which you treat them is going to have substantial impact on them, if you're not going to let them use public facilities, if you're not going to let them have an equal chance to admission to a school or an equal bite at the apple of a good job, you have to be able to offer a reason that is a good reason, a reason that cannot be reasonably rejected. And if the only reason is we don't give those kinds of jobs to people like you, that's not really a reason. That's just a statement of a fact that reflects a power differential, which is the status differential, right? And so racism, gender discrimination, religious discrimination involve bypassing the need to give reasons. They are on their face unjust and unjustifiable on Scanlon's account. The second wrong of discrimination is the humiliation that occurs when one is denied what Scanlon calls associational goods. And so to be clear, right, when you live in a society with status inequality, when you discriminate against somebody, you're not just denying them a job or a place at a school, you're often denying them friendship or the right to marry who they would like to marry, etc. And so it's not just that narrows their world, closes them off from the good of being able to form friends and meet and spend time and maybe fall in love with whomever they want to. it's also that often tends to affect one's sense of one's own worth. And we're going to talk more about internalization in a moment. But if one is, from a very young age, consistently treated as different and less than equal, that tends to wound self-respect. And again, this is an independent reason to object to status inequality. Third reason has to do with our tendency to rationalize, to try to suggest, and this is sometimes called the just world hypothesis or just world fallacy. This is the idea, well, if a class of people is being treated differently from the rest of us, there must be a reason, right? It must be something about them that warrants that differential treatment. It must be that they are lazy or ignorant or dishonest, etc., right? Or simply not capable. Maybe they're better confined to the domestic sphere because they're too fragile to be in the hustle and bustle of the workaday world, right? This tendency then to want to say, we must be right in discriminating against them. There must be a good ground for excluding them, leads us to falsify our beliefs and to falsify our beliefs in ways that are going to lead to further unequal treatment. So in one sense, you might say that implicit in this is the idea that everybody has the right to be understood in their own terms, via a judgment that reflects who I actually am and not your stereotype of me, at least if you're proposing to do things that affect me significantly. Fourth and finally, the internalization of discriminatory attitudes and the harm that does to self-respect. There's a work I've talked with you about before, Claude Steele's Whistling Vivaldi. Steele is now a dean at UC Berkeley, was for a very long time one of the best regarded social psychologists at Stanford University, which is one of the hubs of interesting social psychological research. And he wanted to try to understand the test score gap, the idea that different people get different scores by race or by gender. And that this seems to be not a reflection of differences in intelligence or aptitude, but instead something about the stress of taking the test. He was able to demonstrate this by putting people in stress-free situations, by actually monitoring the stress reaction in the body. And he concluded, and again, through a series of novel, clever experiments, he demonstrated that it's the social evaluative stress of knowing that there's a stereotype about you that suggests that you should do less well on this task, that in fact debilitates people, prevents them from doing as well as they could do if the stress and the evaluative threat were removed. And what this gets at is that these discriminatory attitudes are deeply internalized in a society with status hierarchies. And so this is a fourth objection, right? The consequence that it has for my self-respect, for my capacity to truly understand my potentials and to work in the social world to realize them, this is undermined by a society that has fundamental differences in status attached to superficial attributes. All right, focusing now specifically on the harms of discrimination. The fact that people are denied valued forms of employment, I think, is pretty straightforward, right? The fact that they are denied political equality is also pretty straightforward. If we look at the composition of Congress today, it is getting more diverse, both in terms of race and gender, but it's still nothing like representative of our society. And this reflects in part prevalent attitudes about what powerful people should look like. It also reflects the fact of gerrymandering. And clearly, this is a gross violation of the idea of political equality. The denial of public services. We're in the midst of a national protest movement over the fact that if you're African American, you get treated fundamentally differently by the police than if you are white, right? And that's true for the court system, that's true for prosecutors. It makes its way through the entire criminal justice system. By the way, if we looked at ambulance or fire department or police response times, if we looked at accessibility of good healthcare, if we looked at accessibility of nutritious food, right? In all of these regards, discrimination tends to create unequal life chances and fates for the people who are of different status groups. Fourth, the denial of associational goods. We've talked about this already. The people who will be friends with you, the people who will show you respect, the people who are your potential life partners. All of that is constricted when there are broad-based discriminatory attitudes against a group that you belong to. So then what are the objections to status inequality? And here Scanlon focuses on three of them. Persons are barred from goods and opportunities for no good reason. Persons are deprived of the good of being able to relate to others as equals. And persons are led to value or disvalue their own lives for false reasons. And I want to focus on that third one for a moment, and in a sense to focus on the first half, to value their own lives for false reasons. And there is a idea that is circulating a lot right now, and this is the idea of white fragility. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to get you the full citation of the author whose book this is associated with. This is Robin DiAngelo's concept, white fragility. And to now relate this to the idea of valuing one's own life for a false reason, if we go back to W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African-American sociologist, one of the founders of the NAACP, one of the luminaries of analysis of race relations in America, he suggested in one of his writings that racism may actually be worse for white Americans than it is for Black Americans, not in terms of the injuries that vulnerability to police violence or sexual violence or inequalities in wealth and income. All of that obviously, right, is stacked against African Americans, and incomparably so. But at a psychological level, what Du Bois suggested is that people who value themselves in part by disvaluing another group for no reason other than the pigment of their skin, the color of their skin, the composition of their features on their face, at some level know that they have falsely secured their sense of their own standing. They are fragile. They are plagued by self-doubt. They perhaps have to violently maintain hierarchy precisely because they recognize that there's no rational basis for it. And so I just want to point out to you that when persons are led to falsely value their own lives, to value their own lives for false reasons, it is perhaps as pernicious as when people are led to falsely disvalue their own lives. And I think part of what we are confronting as a society right now is the power of white privilege, but also the fragility of those who think their own self-worth in racial terms. All right. Fourth and final category of ideas here have to do with objecting to economic inequality when economic inequality converts into status inequality. And although Scanlon doesn't say this, I think it's pretty easy to read the subtext out of this. I've shown you data that suggests that 70 years ago, the difference between the top and the bottom in the in the income distribution in the United States was very narrow. And that over the last 50 to 70 years, it's grown and it's grown and it's grown, and it's gotten to be really as unequal or more unequal than it was during the most unequal period that we have data for, the Gilded Age. It's made us among the most unequal developed societies in the world. And the result is that we have become a much more status conscious and status differentiated society, a much more hierarchical society, a society where it matters more and more how you mark your status. And that is then something that Wilkinson and Pickett and other authors, Case and Deaton, et cetera, are showing is doing tremendous harm to us physically, psychologically, socially. But in addition to that, I think Scanlon might say this is doing a moral injury to us as well. And so let me unpack this for a minute. Scanlon, drawing on the work of others, differentiates three different kinds of poverty. And I think this is really useful conceptual work. Subsistence poverty is the kind of poverty that keeps you from paying your rent and your doctor's bill and fixing your car and eating at the same time, right? Those are all things that you need to subsist, and yet you can't do all of them at the same time. That's the kind of poverty that we're most familiar with, that we typically think about. But that's not the only kind of poverty. Another kind of poverty is what he refers to as status poverty. And so I'm about to teach a bunch of first-year students in Sarah Lawrence. I don't know whether I'll be doing it in person or not, but I'm pretty confident if they show up on campus, they're all going to show up with these, right? You know, and frankly, a student who shows up without a cell phone. Sorry, I know the screen is little. I was holding up my cell phone for you to see. The student who shows up without a cell phone is perhaps still going to be able to eat, make it to class, and do whatever else they need to do to subsist, but they're going to be marked out as someone who doesn't have what it is that every other person has in their social group. The funny one that I find that my students have told me about, 5 years ago, people were all listening to music on their phones, but they had headphones that had wires that attached to their phone. Now, they all have headphones that are Bluetooth, right? The AirPods, I believe they're called, if they're made by Apple, right? So there's no cables connecting your phone to the little pods in your ears. And they say that they're aware of it. They don't particularly evince much pride about it, but that they tend to just expect that that's what everybody has, and in a sense to look askance at somebody who doesn't have that, right? And so there are things that you absolutely don't need to subsist that nevertheless can mark you as being less than fully equal in your society. That's another kind of poverty. Third and final kind of poverty is agency poverty. And please note, subsistence poverty depends on our biological and social needs, right? You know, we need clothes, we need food, we need healthcare. Status poverty depends on our attitudes. Is it or is it not okay to not have a phone? And so either we can redistribute goods or we can change our attitudes to eliminate status poverty. Agency poverty depends on the way in which society is organized. What does it take to be fully able to take advantage of the opportunities and to participate in an equal in all cooperative endeavors in your society? And I'll point out to you very quickly, we do research on the use of time, and we do these complicated studies in which people just keep diaries of what they're doing with their time. One of the things we immediately see is that people who have cars, generally speaking, have a much more efficient existence than people who don't. They get to work more quickly. They get to the grocery store more quickly. They tend to live in less dense areas where life can be a little bit easier. Give me one moment. I'm getting a little bit of background. They, generally speaking, therefore live in a bigger world. They're able to do more things. For instance, they can take their children to various kinds of practices or other goods, or see family members or friends, etc. Whereas people who don't, in this society, because this society has been built essentially around the automobile, are not able to do that. Elizabeth, who's organizing this, is from the Netherlands. I lived in the Netherlands for a little while. I didn't have a car. I didn't miss it for a second. That's a society that was built to accommodate people not owning a car. And so either you've got to make sure that everybody has what it is that's necessary to navigate your society as an equal, or else you have to change the way your society is organized and make public transportation less inefficient. Fourth and final objection is that when you evaluate somebody's social standing based on the color of their skin, or the straightness of their teeth, or the quality of their haircut, or whether or not it looks like they've had their Botox recently, you are making evaluative errors. That is to say, you're not actually judging them, as Martin Luther King famously said, by the content of their character, or by the relevant attribute for the good that you hope that they will perform for you. And so again, I hope this is not too analytic, not too abstract. Scanlon is suggesting, in a sense, a detailed indictment of a society that has status differentials in terms of the humiliation that people who are marked as inferior feel, in terms of the psychological harm that it does to self, in terms of the mistakes that we make in the way we access and evaluate each other, not to mention the distribution of opportunities and goods in that society. Again, let me stop for a minute. I've covered a fair bit of material for you, some of it review, some of it new. Let me unmute everyone again and see if you have any questions about the material we're discussing so far. Anybody feel like coming in at this moment?
Yeah, let me just ask you, David.
Is this Matt?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I can't see you, but I hear you. There you are. Okay.
All right. Isn't Scanlon kind of overthinking this? It seems to me that almost everything that he deals with can be dealt with very simply with a very simple rule, which is the golden rule. Just turn it around. How does it look?
So let me just start with the joke that, well, Scanlon's a philosopher. Of course he's overthinking things, right? That's what they do for a living. But having said that, let me then say, well, if it's as simple as all that, do unto others as you would have done unto you, right? Two things. first of all, then why is status inequality so persistent and so difficult to combat, right? And there I think Scanlon might say, you're absolutely right, that in a sense, reciprocity is the underlying logic of contractualism. You've got to give reasons that others can accept, and that means, in a sense, that they have to be reasons that you would accept if you were in their situation, right? And so you are, in a sense, penetrating to a core aspect of this approach. But I think he would also say, frankly, we need some structure. We need some specificity. We have been combating racism in this society for 401 years, right? And yet here it is, 2020. We still have, let's call it 40% of the population heels dug in about not doing anything about it. We need the more specific reasons to flesh out what the golden rule, what reciprocity requires. So that's argument number one. Argument number two is that golden rule reasoning is actually a little bit too self-centered for Scanlon. Do unto others as you would have done unto you implies that the main reason to object is that you wouldn't want to be treated that way, right? That it's in essence self-regarding. And one way to see what Scanlon is trying to do, one way to put it, is he's trying to decenter the self. He's trying to help you to see, okay, well, you know, maybe you would say, sure, if I was Black, I would allow that to happen to me. Or sure, if I was female, I would recognize my place. You know, fortunately, I'm not. That you need to more powerfully remove yourself from the equation and to see it from a more universal perspective. Every person as a person has moral standing and deserves reasons that they can accept or not reasonably reject. And that is in and of itself already a powerful egalitarian commitment that I think Scanlon would suggest the golden rule doesn't fully capture. It doesn't articulate reciprocity and equality all the way down. You want to come back on that, Matt?
No, I'll leave it there. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Anybody else want to raise a question or a comment at this moment?
I do.
And who is this? I can't see yet.
Karen Nelson. Karen Nelson.
Go ahead, Karen.
This is very practical. I didn't know that we were taking your talk out to other people in the community. And last week, I tried for a whole 45 minutes to get into your talk, and I couldn't do it. And I didn't know that it was being used by other people as well. So my request is, please let the people here know before the people other places so that they can get in.
Okay, so Karen, I'm not entirely sure I've got you. So bear with me for a second. There's one other community that is participating in these lecture series.
I didn't know that.
And so this is another human good community, also in the same area.
That's
and
right.
maybe Elizabeth can help me out here a little bit, but it's in the Lake Merritt area. It's called
It's Oakland area.
Grand Lake Gardens.
Grand Lake Gardens, exactly.
And I just looked through the names. As far as I can tell, there are only 2 of us.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, and I hope it will be more. And I think this came out of some desire to reach out.
I don't have a problem with that. I just want to know.
Yeah, no, I'm very happy to have that happen as well. And so I think in a sense it's up to the human good people to really do their best to make sure that if we're going to extend it broader, we do that well.
That's right.
And we call everybody's attention to it. But thank you for noticing that, Karen.
Okay.
We did talk a little bit about that last week.
This is Elizabeth Porter of Grand Lake Gardens, one of those people.
Welcome.
And just, you know, looking at all this from a sort of anthropological point of view, I mean, our society is pretty extreme, but most societies that I can ever think of are not real equal. They have a lot of rules about who has precedence and why they have precedence and who marries who and so forth. It's not that we shouldn't do it, but boy, this is asking a lot of us,
Yes.
both as individuals and as a society.
So Elizabeth, thank you for the comment. And I'm gonna say first thing, I'm not an anthropologist, right? And so in a sense, I recognize what you're saying. I read some anthropology, and I do want to say a little bit in terms of some of the stuff I read. And this has to do with, I guess, a broader anthropological perspective. There's mainly speculative anthropological work on what hunter-gatherer societies were like. And I think it's worthwhile remembering, right, that there's a recent anthropological work called The World Until Yesterday, right? Until around 2,000 years ago, right, let's say humanity has existed in, you know, human social groups for at least 100,000, maybe 200,000, maybe even longer than that, right? We're not entirely sure, but at least 100,000 years, up until around 2,000, 3,000 years ago, right? So until the very recent past, until yesterday, anthropologically speaking, our societies were very different than they are now. And that a lot of the hierarchy, a lot of the status difference, a lot of the political subordination is actually a product of the very recent past. And that prior to that, this is where things get speculative, the anthropological record seems to suggest that hunter-gatherer societies were highly egalitarian societies, that they resisted domination, that they actually had domination defeating strategies, that they redistributed goods in a very equal way. And the relevance of this would be to come back to your comment, how much are egalitarians asking of us, right? Are they asking that we fundamentally modify our deep-seated nature? And if you look just at the last 2,000 to 3,000 years, you might say, yes, it's never been accomplished. And so how could we possibly set the bar that high? But I think if you look both at the longer record, but also a bit comparatively, at what the United States was like 70 years ago. Bracket race, you've only, right, but bracketing race, we were a much more equal society. If you look at what Norway is like, or what Japan was like until quite recently, you know, that there are many examples of more egalitarian societies in many respects. And so I guess I would say, I take the idea seriously. We've got to limit our ideals so that they can be practically realized. It's part of the reason when I get to the policy stuff, I'm going to try to do it in 2 tiers. Here's the low-hanging fruit. This is the stuff we should do right now. Here's the more systematic stuff. We're going to have to wait until we break the logjam in Washington to be able to do that. But I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic or hopeful about what I think the long durée anthropological record reveals. Elizabeth, do you want to respond to that at all?
Well, I'll just say those hunter-gatherer societies tend to be organized in groups of a couple hundred people.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, is, you know,
Yeah.
when millions of people, other things happen.
Yeah, not have much of a state, not have many laws, not have a particularly advanced economy. There's a lot of ways in which we're different. I don't think they had many cell phones in hunter-gatherer societies. Anybody else with a question or a comment today? All right, so I think I will wrap things up. We've covered our hour. I promise, I absolutely, Boy Scouts honor swear, I will get into the stuff on policy next week in order to be able to wrap this up, in order to be able to start talking about some of the stuff that's happening in contemporary American politics with you soon. Take care, everyone. Be safe, be good, be strong, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks for your attention. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.